Good evening, everyone. Sorry we're starting slightly late. We are delighted this evening to be joined by General Khoshal Sadat. The General is the former Deputy Interior Minister for Security in the Ghani administration and the Commander of Special Forces in the last years of it. He was directly involved with the failed peace talks with the Taliban in Doha, and he is a former graduate of Sandhurst. The General is going to make a few remarks at the start, and then he's going to join me on stage for a conversation, and then I'm hoping to open up quite quickly to you guys to ask some questions. But without further ado, the General. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the President of Cambridge Union for inviting me to be here this evening. And thank you for those who made this happen. On 12th of August this year, 3 days before the fall of Kabul, I received a call from President Ghani's office urging me to return to Afghanistan, that I'll be given a senior military position. I could not believe it, that in the final hours of the Republic, President Ghani was changing and moving people from one position to another. I thought about how the Afghan political leadership had failed the Afghan people and the crisis of leadership upon us. In the past 20 years, the international community wholeheartedly tried to help Afghanistan, yet it failed. This evening, we're here to talk about what went wrong in Afghanistan. How were the Taliban able to defeat militaries of 49 countries? To answer these questions, I have listed my thoughts into 4 sections. 1, government and politics. After the 9/11 attacks in New York in 2001, and the fall of the Taliban regime, the international community gathered various warlords from around Afghanistan and glued them into a unity government that was announced in Bonn, Germany. Those warlords were marred with abuse, corruption, and had committed war crimes during the civil war in the 1990s. They were the very reason that the Taliban had risen in the first place in 1996. The president, former president, Hamid Karzai, appeased to the warlords and included them in his cabinet. Many of them who were not representatives of the ethnic majority. From the beginning, justice and equality was undermined. The majority ethnicity Pashtun tribe were sidelined and felt humiliated. Even though the president himself was Pashtun from Kandahar, and there were a small number of high-profile Pashtuns in the government, but unfortunately, those individuals only thought about their pockets and not the people. 2, military and law enforcement. The 2001 Bonn Agreement authorized funding of 30,000 security forces for Afghanistan. In 2007, as the insurgency was gaining momentum, that number grew to 120,000. And in June 2011, when President Obama announced that the withdrawal of combat troops will be completed in 2014, NATO and the United States authorized Afghanistan to have 30,000 armed forces, 300,000 armed forces. Quite a significant number of troops. In my opinion, Afghanistan did not need a large army. Numbers were not the solution. Afghanistan needed institutions that were dedicated and loyal to the nation. Few small special forces units that were trained and advised by the NATO and the coalition were the perfect solution for Afghanistan's problem. Creating an army similar to the West, which are designed to fight large conventional forces, had reduced the quality of a soldier but only focused on the quantity. To fill the ranks of the army faster, the warlords in the cabinet insisted that their former fighters to be commissioned and put in charge of the army. With one single presidential decree, the illiterate, morally and ethically unfit individuals became officers and were put in charge of the army units, army, police, and the intelligence units. Since it was NATO troops and a small number of special forces, who were fighting for the country, the army and police were nothing but a money-making machine. Recruitments, appointments, and promotions were openly sold. Even scholarships to overseas schools were issued based on nepotism. Many who were sent to the Western countries for education would run away and claim asylum, rather than returning back to their country for service. 3, military operations. Intelligence was always a problem. For the first 5 years, any information that indicated a person's connection to Taliban or Al-Qaeda were resulting in detention and imprisonment. The detention and questioning of an individual wasn't as bad as the methodology of how these operations were carried out. I was part of that for most of my career. Though most of the times we were correct and the operations were conducted successfully, but in the grand scheme, it was culturally counterproductive. At night, landing helicopters behind people's houses, detonating their front doors with explosives, followed by heavily armed men entering their homes full of women and children, sometimes resulting in killing or capturing an individual based on unvetted single human information. To my knowledge, until 2009, NATO forces did not have the ability to positively identify armed insurgents with weapons from air. Henceforth, some airstrikes would mistakenly result in killing civilians. Rather than communicating the results of the incidents with the people, we offered apologies. Continuous mistakes and apologies became empty words, and therefore the local populations assumed that NATO and Afghan forces were killing them deliberately. In 2009, US President Barack Obama, during his speech at West Point Military Academy, announced the deployment of additional troops to Afghanistan and an increase in number of Afghan troops. I believe that was too late. There were already approximately 50,000 Taliban fighting us, fighters that we had helped generate by our own mistakes due to bad governance, corruption, rule of law, and military operations that drove them into the hands of insurgencies organized outside Afghanistan. 4, external regional support. This is really aggravating. To this day, US and NATO forces have not had a serious conversation about what to do with terrorist sanctuaries inside Pakistan and their support nodes inside Iran. If the US and international community had the objective of preventing transnational terrorists from launching attacks against their countries, then where was Osama bin Laden found? Watching groups of armed insurgents cross into Afghanistan from Pakistan and kill NATO troops, while Western leaders ignored, it was an utter disgrace and dereliction of duty by the politicians. All of the above reasons broke the will of the Afghan soldiers day by day. Lack of care and bad leadership contributed to the collapse of Afghanistan. In June this year, I resigned from my position in the Afghan government, and many people were left wondering why I decided to leave. No matter how broken or imperfect the Afghan system was, there was still a way for a peaceful settlement and dignified exit for NATO out of Afghanistan. President Ashraf Ghani decided to break the old crooked bone and attempted to straighten it. An academic professor who had the ability to bring in change and make Afghanistan a better place. But he did not know how to manage internal and external politics to benefit the people of Afghanistan. So we had crisis of leadership. President Ghani personally micromanaged and ran the entire government and the security sector. Together with his most trusted advisors, one of them, who he appointed as his national security advisor, who hardly knew the country's geography and had no experience in the security sector. The president personally interviewed every single officer that was being recommended for a position in the army, police, or the intelligence agency, undermining and delegitimizing the roles and responsibilities of the ministries. In May this year, he made another turn in the security leadership and appointed me as the deputy director of the country's intelligence agency, my fourth position in 2 years. He instructed me to arm nearly 30,000 youth throughout the country in order to fight the Taliban. I realized the last thing Afghanistan needs is another street-by-street war. And for a cause of a republic that already was self-destructing. I sent a detailed letter to the president and highlighted the challenges and advised him against arming the warlords. In response, he asked for my resignation. 3 months after my resignation, the entire government collapsed. When I think back to that call I received from President Ghani's office 3 days before the fall of Kabul, urging me to return back to Afghanistan, I think about all the missed opportunities, the bad decision, and the lateness of political leaders when it comes to Afghanistan. After all, we all know it did not have to be this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. I've got plenty to ask, but the General said he's basically happy to take questions on almost all subjects, so I want to move quite quickly, if I can, to you guys. But I want to talk a little bit about your personal experience, particularly at the end of the last century, a little bit about this summer, and then a little bit about the future, and then I'll pass on to you guys. Let's go back to the start. So you were born in 1984, and apart from the very start of your life, you grew up under the Taliban. And I wanted to ask, what are your defining memories of growing up under the Taliban?
Well, the Taliban of 1996 are very different to what we see and read about now. They came to Afghanistan when it had already experienced a very tough civil war, as well as the Soviet invasion, and their thinking was, if they could be more tough than everybody else, they would be able to win. And those days were very, very harsh, and the way they ruled and the way they interpreted religion and rule of law, it was very, very harsh. The memories are quite a lot of stories that I have. Punishment of women, no school or education for women, or music, or the liberties that we. So yes.
But they were broadly welcome because they filled that vacuum post the Soviet occupation. They provided stability and order when no one else seemed like they could.
Yes, and actually the first 40 days they were the sort of saviors, because it was post-Soviet from 1991 when President Najibullah's regime collapsed up to 1996. We've had the civil war and the war between the warlords that I mentioned that President Karzai had sort of brought back to his cabinet. They ruined the country. They turned it into Syria, Raqqa in these days, or Germany after World War II. That's what these warlords turned Afghanistan. And the Taliban were this new face, and they were all against. Their motto was to be against the wrongdoers. So people welcomed them, but they slowly became, when they gave the general order number 1, no women should leave home, no school or education for women, men must have beards bigger than you could you can hold a grip, and so on and so forth. So that's what, it became much, much more challenging.
I mean, I'm interested because a bit later we'll speak about your views on the Taliban now. So I'm just wondering if those views that you hold currently are shaped by your experiences at the very start, but perhaps we'll come back to that later.
Sure.
Yeah. We'll fast forward very slightly to the post-9/11 world. So we've just talked about how the Taliban were received. What about the Americans? How were they received when the coalition forces came in 2002 and 2003?
Yeah, same. They were the freedom, holding the lights of freedom. People welcomed them. I certainly welcomed them, and it truly was a change. We've had the opportunity. I had the opportunity where I am today. That it was due to the sacrifices of the NATO countries and the United States. But the mistakes I mentioned there, good people trying to do the right thing, just not knowing the culture, not knowing what was right, what was wrong, had created this enemy.
Yeah. Is that a strategic thing? Is that because the coalition forces thought they were doing a job that they shouldn't have been doing? Or was it just cultural unawareness?
I think if you look at it higher up in the political level, I think at the time President Bush, Tony Blair, and many other politicians, instead of rushing into what Afghanistan, to Afghanistan and the way they decided to deal with it, sidelining the Taliban, bringing in an interim government, the faces that were not liked by many previous to the Taliban. I think that was a mistake, but you couldn't. I also give them. I can't disagree with them, because if they hadn't made the decision at that time, public support would have been. President Bush would have been under a lot of criticism back home. So it's hard to tell.
I'm just trying to get to the bottom of what went wrong, because it seems like generally the Taliban by 2002, 2003 had lost a lot of public support. You're suggesting that when the coalition forces arrived, they were welcomed. What is it that prevented a lasting solution from developing in those early years?
I think the Americans and the coalition, in 2001 and early days, they were very precise when it came to attacking the Taliban positions from the military perspective. And people welcomed that because they didn't destroy people's houses, they weren't bombing indiscriminately. And the message that we were getting was there will be schools, roads being built, schools being built for the people, agriculture, ability to access the market, and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden, most of the budget just turned towards security. We didn't have the Taliban up to 2005, really, when all of the attention went to Iraq and Afghanistan was just left there. Actually, the coalition forces, mostly the US, were also in a hurry trying to find Al-Qaeda operatives, Osama bin Laden, but they were wrong. Intelligence was wrong. We would go to these villages, and I know we were partners with them, and there was nothing there. I mean, we could see there's no Al-Qaeda here, but still we had to go through people's houses and search their houses, upset them. Nobody wants to see armed men rushing into your house. So culturally very counterproductive. And I know a lot of the Taliban. When later in my career I interviewed them, why did you join? They just said, they disrespected me. You've arrested my father, or some who would say you've killed my father. And so it was more of a revenge thing. So I think we made the mistakes in the first few years that we just created an enemy.
Yeah, so what I'm getting from this is that this wasn't preordained. It wasn't inevitable that we would end up where we are. There was an opportunity, a window in that period where if it was managed better, something more enduring, something more durable might have been developed. Is that your view?
Yeah, two things I believe should have happened there and then. One, the inclusivity, bringing in the Taliban, because Osama bin Laden had attacked the West, but the Taliban were hosting him because of the code, Afghan code, that we welcome the guest. We cannot betray the guest in our home. It's part of the loyalty culture. So Mullah Omar individually said, no, I do not want to give Osama bin Laden to the Americans. And he paid the big price, 17 or 18 years of war in the country. So I think Osama bin Laden was out of the picture. The US and the coalition could still have approached the Taliban and say, it could be part of it. I know Pakistan was trying to mediate, saying, you need to bring the Taliban, but it was completely rejected. The West was busy in Iraq. One. Number two, allocation of budget for Afghanistan. I remember whenever we would ask for budget for reconstruction or building it would always be turned down. They said, it has to go to Congress and so on. But whenever we wanted military or lethal equipment, the budget was there. So I think there was no need to have, if we had the Western countries allocated budget for reconstruction of Afghanistan, I believe this could have been different as well. It did when President Obama took office. The USAID and other organizations received a lot of budget. So it was too late.
That moves us quite nicely into the next topic. But just before we do, sometimes Afghanistan is called the Forgotten War because the attention of most of the West was in Iraq. You served in the military at the time, and then you were an interior minister after that. Was that your feeling on the ground? Did it feel like, the eyes of the world were further west? They weren't on Afghanistan?
Prior to 9/11 attacks?
No. After that.
Yeah, I believe, after the 9/11 attacks, it felt like the West had a free range of wherever they wanted to go. We were actually we were bracing up that the next target will be Iran. So it felt, all of these countries would be attacked. But I wasn't in the position at that time to feel or to think about what would be, the West's thinking.
As I said, the discussion of the Taliban moves us on to the next topic I wanted to bring up, which is the negotiations with the Taliban in Doha. Started under the Obama administration secretly, continued by the Trump administration. And we'll speak more about the Taliban shortly. It's a contentious issue in this country. But in hindsight, I think I've got an inkling of your answer to this question from what you've said in your opening remarks. But were they a good idea, negotiating with the Taliban?
Yes, I do agree with that, because being a soldier, frontline, I've realized that the Taliban is a reality. Their narrative is pretty strong. Their ability to recruit people were pretty good. So we couldn't just ignore. We couldn't kill our way to success. Also, insurgencies, if they have freedom to maneuver, freedom to have sanctuaries and logistic nodes, it's sacrosanct. It's inevitable. We've had the experience of it from Vietnam and other countries. So unless the Western countries were willing to go to Pakistan or Iran to deal with it, then it would have been. We have an expression. It says warming up the ocean, which is impossible. I know Brits have a different saying, but it was inevitable. But so yes, it was important to speak to the Taliban. But the negotiations, I'm sure you hear about it from many people. Keeping Afghanistan government out of it, it was just a big blow to all of us. The US came in 2001, attacked the Taliban. Now they negotiate, and we're left. Those of us, whatever you were selling us, we bought it for 20 years. Now you're sort of leaving. That was the feeling that everybody had.
You used the word success. I think it'd be interesting to know what you think success would have constituted as part of these negotiations. You listen to a lot of the commentators in this country, people like Rory Stewart, people like Tom Tugendhat, and in the States, people like General McMaster, the former National Security Advisor. They think that the negotiations were misconceived. They gave the Taliban too much. They tied the hands of the security forces behind their own backs, and effectively made it a lot harder for the Afghan administration to survive once the US and the coalition had left. So what would have successful negotiations look like to you?
Yes, so one, the United States agreed to release 5,000 Taliban. We worked really hard. We lost a lot of our friends day and night trying to find one of those. Every night, doing night raids or operations, they were released in one decree. So that gave the Taliban an advantage. The second thing, the United States deal with the Taliban limited the support that we would normally receive. Our forces, it's very interesting, politicians, the President of the United States said, look, Afghanistan has 300,000 troops, they have Air Force. We have the best pilots, but we had zero engineer. None of the helicopters were fixed by Afghan engineers or mechanics. They were all by American contractors. The contractors just left. So we had nobody to fix our aircrafts, helicopters, MD-530s, Black Hawks, and all American equipment. Also, a year or two ahead, or many years before the 2020 deal, we would always get US and the coalition air support. Even if an Afghan unit was on the ground, you would have American aircrafts, we would talk to them, and then they'll provide us support. That stopped. They would physically watch our troops die, and we would push them and say, hey, you need to support. I'm sorry, we have a deal in Doha. So that took away our ability to support. The second mistake, which President Ghani, as I mentioned earlier, he micromanaged, he appointed weak leaders. I've had quite a clash with some of our officials in Kabul of trying to stop them to interfere in appointments. Corruption was a big problem, but corruption didn't have to be just money. It was more of the MPs, holding the budget, not approving it because I fired some of the police chiefs who were corrupt, and they wanted them to be in that position, and they pressured President Ghani, saying, "Look, it's a small detail, very pathetic," and that really disappointed the soldiers to fight. I believe it was a tactical defeat because we had weak leaders on the ground, and they couldn't inspire the troops to fight, and those leaders were appointed by the politicians.
And again, so what happened this summer wasn't inevitable in your mind?
So it was inevitable. Had we, as I mentioned before, if we had good leaders to fight, good commanders on the ground, and the support for our especially the Air Force, because Afghanistan geography just relies on. I hear a lot of criticism from some of my former friends that British and Americans say, "Oh, the Afghans didn't fight." Okay, well, how about if I put one of your units in Helmand somewhere without air support? How would you fight? You would not be able to have water, food, ammunition in time. How long will you fight? It's just so the good peace deal. To answer your question, I know I'm giving a long answer. Would have been to sustain that pressure. Good leaders still supporting that. We had to convince the Taliban that you cannot win militarily. Now let's negotiate. The Taliban did not negotiate with us. Some of the negotiations that were happening in Doha, they would openly, and our Afghans who went there, the Taliban looked at all of the Afghan delegation and he looked to Khalilzad, he said, "See that? The Americans, they're defeated. 49 nations, they're defeated and they're leaving. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to discuss terms of surrender." And I know when they turned back, when he came back to Kabul, he said, they don't want to negotiate. It's all in the public. They say, yeah, we want to have the negotiations, the inter-Afghan negotiations. But in the back, they said, we've defeated the 49 nations. We will defeat you. And that's how it was dealt with.
Fascinating and upsetting too. Was the 2,500 troops on the ground and the contractors sufficient for what you're suggesting was necessary? I mean, the Obama strategy was the surge. It was a massive increase of resources. Was what was there in Afghanistan prior to the withdrawal in the summer sufficient to convince the Taliban, as you were saying, that the coalition was willing to stay the course to keep the Afghanistan nascent democracy alive?
Yes, very much. This is very close to my heart, and it's unfortunate because a lot of the Western politicians don't realize the modern soldiers' capability. They still think it's the Vietnam War. They still think the commanders will need more troops. That's not true. Today's soldiers can integrate, can bring in the capabilities. The commander of the coalition forces in Afghanistan, General Scott Miller, proposed to the administration the 2,500 troops. Those troops would have been able to sustain a presence in Afghanistan, a moral support to the Afghan troops, as well as coordinate the mighty Air Force of the US Air Force. It was a very interesting formula that we had created in 2019 and 2020. Internet has given us the advantage to have information in a matter of seconds, no matter from whichever village or district of Afghanistan. We could have had it in a second, and we could turn it into what we call a targeting package and pass it on to a pilot who was flying 35,000 feet from a tanker, and he'll be there in 10 minutes, maximum. So from a spy on the ground who's watching a Taliban about to attack a checkpoint to a pilot to drop a bomb on him, 10 minutes. And we sustained that for a year. In 2019, I believe we broke the Taliban back in 2019. Approximately 35,000 of them were killed, confirmed as you watch them, and then because it was the capabilities, how to bring in the 21st century fifth generation Air Force to a local farmer. And that it was sustainable. It definitely was. But somehow the politicians in the Western countries disagreed. They still thought that these generals would want us to keep on pouring more troops and resources, and that was not true.
I want to come back to the role of the US and the UK just at the end. We'll talk about the future. But I've got a few things I want to stick with just now. Just in our conversations this evening, you come across as a very proud, patriotic man, Afghan. Why did you leave early? I mean, there's been suggestions in what you said in your remarks, but why did you leave in June, was it?
Yes. Well, there are two reasons. One, it was just personally how the president was making decisions and how he was running things. And I realized that we have an expression, you can't call it spring with one flower. It's a very, very common saying. So if I and a couple of my other friends who are also educated in the UK, one of them was a corps commander, has the same last name as me, but we're not related, Sami. We were fighting till the end, and we were winning in a tactical battle that we had, but the rest of the country was suffering. I remember my last fight was in Laghman province, which is east, next to Jalalabad, Nangarhar. It was quite an interesting strategy that the Taliban had. If they had taken Laghman, the fight would have come to Kabul front door. So we sort of prevented it. But just as we got there and we started coordinating, as I mentioned before, the Air Force and our own Air Force and special mission units, about 120,000 Afghan civilians that fled their homes, and they went to a stadium and a park, just living in tents, suffering. We couldn't feed them because we were just a small force. I called Kabul to national security. I said, there's money, there's billions of dollars, and there's a ministry of rural rehabilitation, and they have the budget. We need to help these people. And the war is caused by us and the Taliban. And we, as a responsible country with the $88 billion that the West has paid us, we need to help these people. We hardly had any, and nobody hears about it. It was the suffering of those people as well. And so that gave me personally a thought that, it was not sustainable. And it was a perfect opportunity that even though I had that in the back of my mind and the president just disagreed, I can't believe he decided to accept my resignation. In the time of crisis, if somebody comes to you and he's sort of whining and, as you say, whinging, you would either encourage him or her or get angry or so on and say, get back to your job and okay, I need you here. But he didn't care. He said, okay, approved. So that was it's quite something to think about a leader. It was very disappointing. But then calling me 3 days before the collapse, it was very, so I could not I could not work in such an environment of mistrust and constant.
There's a few things that I'm going to try and tie together here, which includes your view that it wasn't inevitable what happened this summer, your experiences with the Taliban, and some of the things you've said about the future. So I'll try and tie them together. I want to talk briefly about democracy. One of the points you made in your opening remarks was about the lack of institutions to support local Afghans in quite an important period for the country. What about democratic institutions? Two questions. Should we be thinking about looking after democracy in Afghanistan? Is that what Afghans want? And is it possible? Is it possible to entrench those institutions?
I believe it is. I think, but it has to be. We have to think about how we implement it, how we introduce it to the Afghans. I think the Afghan people are living. If you look at the Maslow's hierarchy, it's the bottom. It's shelter, food, ability to feed your family and raise your children in safety. So the word democracy, for the first few years, it was just it was everybody was making jokes about it because they couldn't understand it. And there, if the few letters, if you bring it backwards and forwards, it has a very rude meaning in Pashto. So they're making jokes from it because they just couldn't understand it. But that, I sometimes think about it. Maybe we don't need the democracy. Afghanistan probably needs that hard whip of getting something done, at least for quite some time, where we need to be, where the battle, the guns need to be silent. There has to be some sort of life, and then people will start thinking about civil rights, liberties, democracy, and so on. We just have to silence the guns, I believe.
Yeah. I've got just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to open up to everyone else. What you've just said picks out, in my view, a key tension in some of the things you said this evening. Really, the best lens to look at this through is the Taliban. So it seems like you're quite convinced of the benefits of democracy in Afghanistan. You've spoken a lot about women's rights, human rights, and the need for the Taliban to distance themselves from terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda. And partly you framed that in some of the things I've read that you've written and some of the interviews you've done as sort of realism. It's realistic to recognise that the Taliban are going to be the entity in power in Taliban for the foreseeable future. Is that realistic? Is it realistic to say, I'll come back to Afghanistan if the Taliban are willing to make these concessions, given what we've seen, not only when you were a young man, a teenager, but also what we've seen since the Taliban have come back to power? Is it realistic to think that the Taliban are going to change?
I think that time will tell. If I got your question correct, is it realistic for me to, is that what you mentioned, that for me to go back? I don't think, I have a lot of bad blood with the Taliban for my generation of the security forces. So that's a big no, one. And secondly, because of we still see, abuse and, women not being allowed to go to school and work, as well as extrajudicial killings. But they keep saying that they're going to change. There's a difference now because we haven't seen much public killings or chopping hands and so on. We've also heard that senior Taliban leaders saying we need to keep doing what we're doing now for a while, because if we change fast, their younger fighters will turn against them because saying, why did we do this jihad for 20 years if you're allowing women to go back to school, which is bizarre, but they think they will change once things will quiet down. We shall see. But the reality is that if the Western countries are not willing to send troops again, then Taliban are the reality. What other options do we have? I believe West will be attacked again from Afghanistan. There's something that we're not paying attention to, and that's ISIS. There were about 2,000 ISIS Khorasan, we call it ISIS-K, who we've arrested and captured with so much painfully UK and US special forces for the past 5-6 years. And they're way different to the Taliban. They're extremely sophisticated, smart. Their leader in Afghanistan has 2 master's degrees. We could not catch the guy with the might of signal intelligence that America has. That guy could not be captured. And he's done magnificent attacks in Afghanistan, very brutal and cruel. 2,000 of his fighters just got released. Policharki prison door opened when the Taliban came, and they're all out there. Every day there's an attack against the Taliban. Taliban are suffering every day. They got 5 to 10 people are dying, but they've been dying a lot, so they don't care. What we will see in the next few months, the likelihood is that they will have a safe haven in the east, and very likely you will have, unfortunately, Muslim youth from the west joining them or communicating, and they will attack the west. I 100% believe that. The question to the Western politicians and the Western governments is, what do you do now? Do you go back to square one? Do you tell the Taliban, we're coming again by force to kick your government and we bring another democratically elected government, we do it? Or do you deal with the Taliban? Because what would we do if there's another 9/11 or similar to what London was attacked by Al-Qaeda? Because it will. I do believe it will. What do we do then? That's the critical question. Do we go back? So,
yeah, and I suppose there's another dimension to thinking realistically when it's, your home city of Kabul that's being pilloried and bombed. It always struck me as a strange sentiment to think that it was realistic to say the Taliban were going to change. That always struck me as strange. But I suppose thinking realistically when it's your own city, your neighbours, that's a different calculation to make about what to do.
yeah.
Yeah. The reality is I've got absolutely loads of questions to ask, but I think I'm going to stop now and let some of you guys ask some questions. Do we have any microphones on deck? Brilliant. Okay, so if you just show hands and then I'll... Got 2 over there. So should we go to the back first, please?
Yeah, my question is, going forward, can the United States maintain any influence over the Taliban? Or can we expect them aligning or cooperating with rival powers such as Russia or China?
So it's interesting. The United States still have a pretty good connection and relationship with the Taliban. The Taliban with Russians and Chinese, I don't think there will be. China is very much interested. The Afghan, the resources that we have, the mines and lithium, uranium, and so on. But they have a problem, which is the Uyghurs. The Uyghur Muslims are already moving to northeastern Afghanistan because we have a border with China, and it's very likely that they will send their suicide bombers to China soon. I believe that as well. The last attack in Kunduz province, the guy who blew himself up and killed a few dozen was a Uyghur. So that's a challenge for China. Taliban could say that they want to stop anybody attacking outside Afghanistan, but they can't, because if we, plus the Western countries with all of the technology and weapons and resources, couldn't stop ISIS, the Taliban can't really do it. No matter how many of they're not right now in these days. They're capturing ISIS and they're hanging them in the street and killing them right away. That won't really change. They're just too smart. So China is going to have to recalculate how they deal with the Taliban. Russia, they're worried as well because the northern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan are the front line right now, and a lot of their youth who are disgruntled and they want to join, they want to be part of a jihad. They're moving into Afghanistan and training, and possibly they will be another threat for them. But maybe, for us to, conspiracy now is that maybe the West wanted that. China is the next foe, and Iran. It's a perfect opportunity. Let Afghanistan be a wild land, and let all these snakes be grown there, nurtured, and let them attack our enemies. Why? Maybe that's the perception now in the Afghans.
That's the Afghans' perception.
Perception, but it's realistic.
But I mean, it's funny. It's a region with 2 nuclear powers and the biggest democracy in the world. It doesn't seem to be in the West's interests for Afghanistan to be an unstable place.
Actions are very different to what they say. So, yeah.
There was another question just over there.
Hi, I was just going to say, obviously with Afghanistan, this sort of legacy of being sort of drawn up by colonial powers and its sort of distinctive sort of tribal loyalties throughout the country, would you accept the view at all that perhaps Afghanistan is ungovernable by a centralized government, and perhaps that's reflected by the sort of continual failures for anyone to sort of succeed in controlling it?
I think about it quite a lot, but Taliban seem to be governing it pretty well right now. It is just that they don't have money to run it effectively and efficiently. You either go full democracy that we had for the past 20 years, or you have a dictatorship and autocracy that the Taliban have. The latter is working right now, but people are unhappy. It's safe, people are able to move around, they just don't have a job and money to feed their family. So we had this similar example for 40 years with the king. He ran it very smoothly, and I think the Taliban will as well if they change. So.
Excellent, lots of questions. There's two at the back there. We'll go the person on the left and the person on the right at the back.
Thank you. I think I could ask a million questions. It's been absolutely fascinating. But recently, the New York Times published, a large investigatory piece into a bombing in Syria in Baghouz, and it highlighted some of the failures of Western controls on war crimes and what our soldiers got up to. And I think there are terrible stories also out of Iraq and Afghanistan of British soldiers and what war crimes or certainly atrocities that they committed there. And I wonder, when you talk about things that were culturally unhelpful and strategic errors, I wonder if you could talk about also perhaps the direct human cost of some of the failures of Western troops in their intervention in that time.
So the Western militaries were very professional, even though that some soldiers who had committed atrocities were investigated very thoroughly. So I won't say that the Western countries deliberately encouraged or the war crimes were left unanswered. Afghanistan and I'm sure many Muslim countries is very delicate. Even if you go to somebody's home and if a man looks through a woman's closet, it's very culturally wrong. And most of the times, even our soldiers, soldiers from Kabul, the guys who were not, the city boys, would look through women's clothes just in case if there's a weapon or something. I'm giving an example, small example. And that really angered people. That why are you going through this? So unintentionally, they all had no bad intentions. So they weren't beating people or they weren't committing any crime, but just that small mistake was creating an enemy. So you can driving tanks through their village, bursting their water pipes as you drive through their village, and knocking their walls. That's clearly, for a poor family, that's clearly going to, they will go away. And then across the border in the tribal areas of Pakistan, there are active training centers, just like Sandhurst or anywhere else, like Catterick, where they're just training soldiers and sending them every day. So, and that's where they went.
There was a question next to Freddie as well.
Is it? Oh, okay, now it's on. Thanks. I've enjoyed what you've said so far. Leading into what my friend here just said, I want to talk about practical methods of conducting warfare where you can not stoke the flames that drive the Taliban's recruitment. Can you conduct a war successfully with these considerations? How do you do that? Especially in that environment where it's continual aggressive warfare.
Well, to start with, you should go to the core or the root of the problem, and that's stopping the enemy from having a safe haven or all of their routes to be blocked. And we didn't do that. We left the doors open. And two, technology have helped in the past few years, especially from 2006 onwards. The drones and the full motion videos that were attached to the aircraft, you could tell if a person is hiding a weapon, because the sensors could pick the weapon and you could strike, preventing a civilian from being killed. I know the Americans were so good at, they developed this new ammunition that I watched once. It was a bomber who was on a motorcycle. He was riding, and along the way he gave a lift to a civilian who had nothing to do. The guy jumped in the back, and we said we have to strike this guy, otherwise he's going to go and blow the road. They struck the speedometer, killed the front guy, the main guy, and the guy at the back just flew off the motorcycle, stood up, dusted himself off, and walked. It was the capabilities that they developed. You know, you can strike a room where this room and the other room would be totally fine. Nothing would happen because the munitions are so precise and so smart that you can prevent collateral damage. You can calculate which side of the room you can hit where these people will be damaged and this guy will be safe. So this is that good. So you can actually do it if you have good intelligence and you use smart munitions instead of dropping a big 500-pound bomb and destroying the neighborhood. That's what can create more wars. And we've done this for the first 10 years. We deliberately dropped bombs and killed lots of innocent people. And we created more enemy.
Just on that, I mean, you spoke about things that might have been culturally insensitive that turned local populations against the coalition forces. But I mean, that's a slightly more obvious reason why local populations were turned off the coalition forces, because they dropped bombs in places where the intelligence wasn't good and did not kill enemies, killed civilians. You think that's solvable with technology?
Yes, absolutely. If you have the population here and there's one bad guy comes in and he's planting a bomb in the village, normally prior to the technology, we would go and search the entire village because we've had a bomb there. But actually, the guy came from another area. He wanted to create. They're very smart. He wanted to make the village our enemy, and we just fall into their trap. But nowadays, you could just unpluck that one individual from the area, and people were actually cheering. We were like, yes, it's doable.
I'd like to give the opportunity to ask a few more questions if you've got time. There's one just here. Yeah. No, you at the very front.
You touched briefly on cultural differences. So I guess my question is, what's the best way to increase understanding of cultural differences between people and governments so that you can, I guess, strategize and implement whatever you're planning more effectively in your experience?
Last August, the US targeted a vehicle that was supposedly had a terrorist in it, but it ended up killing 10 civilians, including 7 children. And then when the Pentagon launched an investigation, they actually recommended and I quote, no legal or disciplinary action. When just a typical Afghani citizen sees this in a media platform, don't you think that this has been one of the most driving factors that influenced a large segment of the population to join terrorist groups such as Taliban, ISIS-K, and presumably other groups?
I agree. I totally agree. This is one of the 2,000 mistakes that had happened in the past 20 years. I beg your pardon? One of it. Definitely not the main, but definitely, I mean, loss of life, it cannot be reversed. So that, and to your question, I think just studying a culture, the West came with complete good intentions, but no knowledge of how you can help when it comes to governance, security, setting up government offices, just lack of understanding.
Great. There's a question there. I'll go to that gentleman there first. Let's stay on this side, and then at the back, please. Two at a time. And then there's one over there in a second.
Yeah, I know. I've just come from the gym, so I wouldn't normally wear this. General, you've uncovered me already. But my question is about the Afghan Army and the security forces more generally. But by way of context, I am an Army officer in the British Army, and I served most recently in Afghanistan in 2019. I don't think we overlapped at Sandhurst, but maybe. I'm not sure. But then my question, if we're focused on building an army less reliance on the sort of exquisite Western capabilities we've all discussed, you know, the sort of the drone capabilities, aviation, etc. And focus more on the sort of principles that you and I learnt about at Sandhurst very early on in the campaign, and I'm thinking 2004. Would we have had more success? And why do I ask it? Because I do think there are parallels and lessons for some of our ongoing campaigns in the Middle East and North Africa. It'd be useful to get your views on that.
It's been a real pleasure listening to you, because I think that in the media coverage around Afghanistan, especially in the West, Afghani voices, diverse as they may be, are silenced or even like unheard. And I mean, I just want to say that I feel like, I don't know, this has been a really profound experience for me, so thank you very much. My question is, something you highlighted was kind of, I suppose, the ineptitude of the coalition government to lead. And I want to ask you, what do you think are good characteristics of a leader, of a good leader? And perhaps for this, engaged group of students that are here, how does one cultivate those qualities?
It's quite an ocean of answers there, but I want to connect both. Thank you for what you're doing and what you've done. It's something I always think about. What was the mistake? I believe, UK has a much more. It's much better than the rest of the 48 other countries when it comes to training indigenous forces. I'm the product of it. I think if I call myself a professional of any sort, but I was a product of a UK trained institutions. What in early stages, in 2002 and 3, the British Army and the US as well decided to train from company level below, train good soldiers, NCOs, and officers. But they didn't want to touch anybody above that, and that was a bad experience. I think the loss of, the collapse of Afghanistan was not from a company below; it was above. It was the decisions that were made in the corps level and brigades and so on. And because that was politically sensitive, the coalition forces did not want to touch it. So spend all the money and effort training an army, raising an army, but the decision at the top was made, and all the efforts were reversed. Now, when it comes to technology, I think it's inevitable. We didn't have the technology that the British and American army had. I remember we used to walk behind the NATO forces. They had night vision, and we would be sort of walking like camels behind them, all the way up to 2007, when we started receiving the equipment and technology and lasers and night vision and so on. But the principles were, leadership was very much important. How to lead from the front. The definition of leadership is, the ability to inspire your subordinates to do things, to complete a task. We didn't focus on that. Afghanistan sadly appointed leaders who were connected to somebody. Anybody from armchair could tell soldiers or employees or staff to go do this and things will get done. But a leader has to go to the front, feel the pain of how your troops are, what they're going through. I always used to stand in front of we call it the breach, where explosives were being, not just to watch, and the guys in the middle of the night would say, they didn't know it was me. So get the fuck back, what are you doing here? But I wanted to see what they do. Who is actually courageous enough and working hard? Because when the board would come and who should be promoted, I wanted to promote that very guy who was standing in front of the breach. So you had to take the risk of going to the front. And that's what it is, leaders that care. But again, this is a long subject of leadership, but yeah. I hope that answered your question.
You do 2 more questions and then call it, oh Christ. Just here, the first hand, and the gentleman behind you.
Hi there. Firstly, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. It's been really informing. My question was, how much do you think religion has played a part in this? It's something we've not really touched on. I was wondering if, obviously, these extremist groups are Islamic. Do you think that they have changed your view on religion? And within the Afghan people, do you think they view the Taliban as one view of Islam and their view of Islam as totally different? Do you think they're conflated? Or do you think people are now becoming maybe even disenfranchised from their original beliefs because of what's happened over the last few months, potentially?
I was just wondering, what happened to the Northern Alliance and why didn't they stand up to the Taliban as Afghanistan collapsed? So, for example, General Dostan or the anti-Afghan strongholds like Mazar-e-Sharif, why didn't they provide effective opposition?
So I'll cover both of those. So the Northern Alliance were the group, again, that the Taliban had risen against. Dostum, Atta, and other leaders were, I would say, they're very corrupt, very, always changing sides, pressuring the central government for various positions and, embassies, ministries, and so on, so they could make money. And people sort of, they hated them. And second thing is that the Northern Alliance don't have a leader. Their leader, the former leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was a leader. He was always at the front. He was through thick and thin with his fighters, and so people respected him and they wanted to fight for him. Right now, his son is trying, I believe, but he's not there. He's not in the country, so he's outside, and you cannot really fight if you're outside if you're not at the front. The Northern Alliance leaders also made a lot of money, quite significant amount of money. That they bought properties in Turkey, London, in Dubai. So people who enjoy, the life, and they don't want to fight. So I think they've lost their narrative, and not many people want to fight. Religion is, the Taliban that came in first 1996. We had just gone past, we just had this communist regime which was against religion. It was pure, God didn't exist and so on. And the Taliban wanted to bring this. The Mujahideen were also, preaching that for Islam, but the Taliban brought that back to the people, forcing people to go 5 times a day, you have to go pray and so on. But this time they're taking it much, people have already got it. They've practiced religion in the past 20, 30 years. So the Taliban narrative, when it comes to religion, doesn't work. So it has to be more on corruption, nepotism, lack of. So that's their narrative now. They're very smart how they gather support. So religion is really taking the back seat now.
Are you staying for a drink after this?
No, I have to.
Right.
Yeah.
In which case, we'll do one more round of questions and then we'll call it that. So there's one at the back. I'm going to say the person next to them. And then if it's a quick one, the man at the front here, and then we're done.
Yep. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I wanted to ask, you touched on it briefly, but what is the role of Pakistan, powerful power, neighbor? What is Pakistan's role in all of this, and its future role as well? Thank you.
Hello. Now it works. Okay. You mentioned how it's very likely for the USA to let Taliban wreak havoc just for the sake of China and so on. So if this is likely or very probable, I just wanted to ask, is the USA going to give up on the whole notion of liberty and one side just to use it as a means to an end? And if the US is planning to do this, how do you know that this was the motivation to begin with for going to Afghanistan? So thank you.
Going back to the earlier question about China and the Uyghurs, it seems almost a requirement to be a superpower to have successfully invaded Afghanistan and then got stuck and kind of withdrawn with your tail between your legs. How likely do you think it is that China will do the same in the future?
Pakistan, US, and China.
Yeah. I'll take China very quickly. I think Chinese have already said, and I do believe that they will, they've learned the lessons of what Russia and Soviet Union and the United States have experienced. So they're pushing more towards economic connectivity and relationships. So I think that they'll sustain that relationship. I don't know if they're going to act militarily or they will decide to. I don't know what they will do. Secondly, when it comes to the U.S., it's a very hard question. You should ask an American if they still believe that. But actions. What we saw was what the world saw in Afghanistan. It was, I think, it's questionable. I'm sure the politicians in Washington are feeling some heat in the upcoming elections. Pakistan, very interesting. Pakistan wants a peaceful Afghanistan. I believe that. I think they want a friendly, pro-Pakistan neighbor, and I agree with that. I think we should have a good relationship with Pakistan, but not the way they were trying to achieve that objective. My good friend and boss, General Stanley McChrystal, once said, Pakistan is like a monkey's hand stuck in a candy jar. You can't let go. The Taliban were they invested in the Taliban for the past 25, 30 years, and they completed it till the end. For the second time. Whether it's going to stay is questionable. Whether this pro-Pakistan government will remain, I don't know. But I hope they learned their mistakes. From '96 to 2001. I hope that Pakistan government was advising the Taliban. I hope they will be advising them what not to do this time. Otherwise, this victory will not be long. It will collapse again. So when it comes to what they did in the past 20 years, they masterfully deceived the Americans, because they know Americans and NATO will come in once a year, and then they will go, and next guy will come, and then the Pakistani generals with their canes and cigarettes, we're smoking 2 packs every day, and tricking them, and they will come back and say, we've seen the base here in Miramshah, the Haqqani network coming and attack our base. I say, we will look it up, and they go there, nothing's there, because the day before or night before they've told them, get up, you just got caught, the Americans found you. So you could, it's no secret. We saw it from above. We speak to them, so on. But because they can, they were able to deceive the West. And then it's, again, as I mentioned before, I don't know why the West could not convince Pakistan that you can actually play a positive role in Afghanistan by supporting a democratic government. So I hope they change. So thank you.
It's probably time to wrap up. I've let that run slightly longer, but there were so many excellent questions, and I thought it was worth getting to them all. They're far better than my questions. Thank you, General, for taking generously so many questions yourself this evening. It's been a pleasure listening to you this evening. I should probably do a quick set of reminders. Tomorrow afternoon is Jeffrey Donaldson of the DUP. We've got the Labour debate. We've got Labour debate on Thursday evening, and then it's the elections this weekend. But can we all give General Sadat a big round of applause? Thank you.